Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to watch our latest Spotlight interview with Contara member Airside. I'm with Peter Davis today, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Airside, a digital services company based in the Washington, D.C. area with a huge experience in running ID verification programs for clients in the public and private sector. So, Peter, thank you very much for making time today to chat. First up, tell me a bit about Airside. What's the history? Where did you come from and where are you focused today?
Sure. So Airside was founded quite some time ago by a couple of former DHS employees who wanted to optimize the travel experience through airports. And so the flagship product for Airside was Mobile Passport, and Mobile Passport was a means for US and Canadian citizens to expedite their way through Customs and Border Protection at airports, about 35 airports across the US. Over the course of that operations for many years, grew from a footprint of 1 to a footprint of 35 some odd airports and over 10 million downloads. So it's become a very, very successful, highly applauded application over this course of its existence. Airside transformed into a more broad digital identity services company several years ago. I came in and joined a number of very brilliant engineering folks and business and product management folks to further both the travel sector focus that Airside started with, as well as to expand in other vertical markets. And so we really pride ourselves on putting the user at the center of an identity transaction and putting them in control of their identity information. And that has been a key pillar of our design ethos ever since. And so we focused really on user managed identity release, information release, and no centralized aspect to our architecture whatsoever.
Okay, so I guess with being involved heavily in the travel industry, you're very close to the end user, you're close to the person who's holding that mobile passport, or that they possibly get the connection to identity assurance and maybe in a different way than you might if it was hidden behind a government services gateway or something. What have you observed about consumer behavior and about what people are feeling with regards to their identity over the last few years?
So speaking just from the travel sector, the driving force for the consumer is not about control. They don't view it as a primary function of controlling their identity. It is about speed through the airport. I mean, if you distill it down to its bare essence, that's really what people are excited about. And Mobile Passport,
what we're trying to do actually,
exactly,
rather than get them identity verified.
And so Mobile Passport was the first example of that, where you went from going through a lengthy line, even as a US citizen going through US immigration was, often took 30, 40, 50 minutes to get through at, depending on the time of day. With Mobile Passport, with a dedicated lane, you would literally go through immigration in 5 minutes. And so further along in our journey, as we recently just launched the TSA mobile identity platform, that took that same speed through the airport vision and applied it now to security checkpoints as you enter airports. And so that was that is the value proposition to the consumer. It's instrumented in a way that it makes it simple for the user to do that exercise, but also meets the regulatory requirements of TSA and Homeland Security to make sure that the vetting and verification process behind the scenes is sufficiently robust to meet their requirements. And so that was, and now with the TSA program in place in DFW and soon in many other airports, you with a dedicated lane in DFW, again, even compared to pre-check, you're still getting through the line quite a bit faster than even pre-check. And you
And
don't
is
even
that
have to
just for
pull out a
people with
boarding pass or anything.
sorry.
I'm sorry?
So I didn't mean to cut over you there, but is that for people just with American or Canadian passports, or can that apply to other nationalities as well?
So for the initial pilot program, it's restricted to US citizens and IAL level 2 verified identities. So
Okay.
you have to be able to have documents that will allow you to achieve that level of assurance to participate in that program.
Okay. So yeah, obviously over here in Europe, we could do with some of that, I think.
Right.
different perspective. But so yeah, I mean, you talked there about IAL, Identity Assurance Level 2. That's for those that may be new to this industry. That's very much around having a number of documents, a number of proofs of identity that kind of give assurance in the broader sense that you are who you say you are, and can be used to kind of confirm from one organization to another that this person is a credible individual and highly verified customer or individual. But what from your perspective does that whole notion of high assurance mean? Is it the same across all sectors? What have you learned in travel that could be applied into other sectors? Because I guess what's high assurance in one place isn't necessarily the same as a highly assured individual for a different sector or a different use case, or am I simplifying it too much?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. IL2 and the rest of the levels of verification described at 863.3 are reference points. And in the world of identity assurance, it's really a continuum. As is common, you want some sort of benchmarks of saying to be IL1, you're this, and IL2, you're that, and IL3, you're that. That helps with things like compliance. What I've seen in practice, though, is that different kinds of transactions, whether they're online or offline, require different degrees of certitude about assertions about an identity. So, for example, the risk to a business about relying upon an assertion of age or relying upon the assertion of your identity that is suitable for travel are different places in that continuum. And even things like KYC AML, for example, while there are specific checks that have to be performed for those kinds of financial transactions, in general, that's just another point in that continuum.
Okay.
And so the challenge thus far has been that achieving IL2, for example, which is probably the most common strong verification level that people see in the marketplace today, is a somewhat onerous process for the consumer to achieve. It's compulsory for the business to achieve that level, but it's a huge friction point for their consumers on how to achieve that level of verification. And I have to do it for every single kind of transaction, all over again when I do IAL2 for Bank 1 or Bank 2 or this investment community or for TSA. And I have to go through that same ritual of pulling out my driver's license or passport, proving my identity, doing the scans and all that kind of stuff, and the selfie matches is a time-consuming process. And the part that Airside is really accelerating with is taking that verified identity and making it reusable on the device. And so it no longer becomes an issue to take a high degree assurance identity and applying it to use cases that don't necessarily need quite that level of diligence. And so you change the market dynamic of asking for a level of assurance from the user without making them go through a huge verification ritual that is friction between me and the checkout button, for example.
So what's stopping us, do you think, getting to sort of interoperability between sectors where you have got that, exactly as you describe it, which sounds like heaven, that basically I can take my device, my mobile phone, I can take my verified identity that's been through a bank over here and use it when I'm going through the airport. What's the biggest challenge to that, do you think?
I mean, obviously the industries as a whole, not only within a certain vertical like travel, but more horizontally as an industry, we need to start developing some of these standards. I mean, there are some standards that are emerging. Some of them are compliance and audit related standards to prove that you're doing the process correctly, such as the 863.3 audits that Conterra does. And others are in technological interoperability to use the same vocabulary for certain types of assertions and things of that sort. And there's work afoot in an interoperable wallet and interoperable identity assertions, and there's a bunch of different industry consortia focused on this stuff now. I mean, my days go back to X500 and X509 and LDAP, where ISO was the establishment body for a lot of those standards. I think while they play a key role going forward in things like mobile driver's licenses, there are literally dozens, if not hundreds of consortia out there trying to accomplish this level of nirvana, that having a true interoperable identity across a vast array of industries is still a long, is a long road to hoe. We're not, we're just at the beginning of that journey. Yep.
Yeah. And as somebody who works in the industry, so just thinking of yourself as a consumer, as an individual, citizen of the US, and yet you know all of this industry so well. What's your biggest frustration personally? What from your history, what would you kind of really like to call out?
Wow. So I think that the hardest part is bridging the technology to human aspect of what we're talking about. That bunch of engineers can sit in a room and figure out interoperability. It's going to take a long time, and there's going to be a lot of competing views, but we can eventually get to not one, but a small number of interoperable standards. I mean, I saw this in the Federation days when there were literally a dozen standards out there for how Identity Federation worked. And now we're down to basically 2, OAuth and SAML. And you see those out there pretty much uniformly across the industry. And so I think that same kind of phenomenon is going to happen here. But the part that is the most interesting is the human machine interface to how we describe identity to the user that doesn't sound like engineers trying to describe identity to a user. Because that's kind of where we are today. And we fall back on things like wallet metaphors and other things because they feel familiar, but they're not really meaningful representations of what we're talking about. Because I could have multiple identities that represent me as a social individual versus a business individual versus some hobby that I participate in, and I'm going to project my identity slightly differently and elevate some facts and suppress some facts more or less depending on how that context that I'm in.
Yeah.
And so the HMI really needs to be able to understand that. And that's a part that is just now starting to get some attention in academia.
Right.
And then layer on top of that, and oh, by the way, all of this stuff needs to be governed by a set of privacy principles that the user ascribes to. And users don't understand privacy like a technologist understands privacy, but they want to know that their stuff, the data that they're releasing is meaningful for the context of the transaction and is not just going to turn into a cash cow for some business by selling my identity data to the lowest bidder, the highest bidder. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is the biggest challenge to the industry. It's not technology at all. It's about how we present all of this technology to the user in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So tell me about yourself. What's your background and how did you get to this wonderful place in the whole world of user managed identities and interoperability and all the rest of it?
So my early forays in identity stem from the early days of the web hosting industry, back when I was at UUNet Technologies, which was a early ISP startup in the US, eventually global. And we started this little business unit called the Web Hosting Business Unit. And we quickly realized, and so we hosted websites in our data centers, is sort of the cut to the chase, which in the mid 90s was an unheard of concept. But for UUNet, our data centers were on our backbone, which was one of the largest in the industry. And so people paid a premium for being parked to the closest, high bandwidth networks around.
Right.
And this is back when everyone was, modem. You had modems in their house for accessing the internet, and very quickly we realized the B2B quality or aspect of the emerging web world, and started building services around what at the time we called extranets, which were really just B2B exchanges between a business and their business customers.
Yeah.
And so from that and a bunch of access control bumps and bruises along the way, got involved in the very early days of after SAML 1.0, but really I started hardcore into federated identity and other areas when Liberty Alliance was first formed, which is a predecessor of Contero.
Contero Initiative.
And so, and so I was involved both from a technology standpoint in what was then the IDWSF architecture. So everyone was still thinking SOAP back then. And IDFF, which was essentially the next generation of what became SAML 2.0. And then an equal smattering of technology and policy, which is how I got so much involved in privacy. And some incredibly smart people at Sun and elsewhere that were involved in the early days of Liberty that were instrumental in sort of framing how I view identity, and I think largely how the industry has looked at the identity since. And a lot has changed since then. And but federation was really kind of the first baby step. And to get a sense for adoption curves, SAML 2.0 came out in the early 2000s, and it wasn't really until the mid-teens that it really started to get serious adoption and traction at the consumer level. I mean, I think B2B and internal federations started to happen a lot quicker, but the risk associated with relying on external IDPs to do transactions to your system was still an uncertainty that businesses were reluctant to sign up for. And so, but so literally 10 to 15 years of slow, methodical realization of the optimizations and improvements in the identity industry outweighed the risks that businesses were reluctant to take at the time in the early days.
And what gets you out of bed now as CTO?
Well, I can tell you what keeps me up at night. That would be one part, but no. So what gets me out of bed? So I've been involved in startups a number of times, and I always find that the most exciting part of a startup is every day is a chance to have some new epiphany about how the industry works, or how you can improve your product in a way that really fundamentally changes the game. And so working with the team, brainstorming around not only the technology of how to innovate in the identity space, but also to make it a better experience for our customers, I think is a really exciting place to be. And
Yeah.
like I said before, we have a great team of engineers and product and UX people that are instrumental in making those waking moments a realization.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the certification process. You've obviously just been through the sort of the audit process for IAL2, which is the Kantara identity assurance program that we run for NIST 863.3. How has that been, and why do you think it's so important now that organizations do get certified and we start to see that sort of standardization across the industry?
So, I mean, I talked before about this continuum of measures and levels of assurance, and I think it's important to have these benchmark reference points that that are a lot easier for compliance departments to set expectations and goals to their engineering teams and their business partners to achieve that. The process itself, I think, is, like any other audit and compliance process. I've been through SOC 2 and 27001, and I mean, we've certainly seen our share of audits in the technology space over the many years. And I have to say that the 863 audit is probably, quite a bit simpler than, say, a SOC 2 audit. I think the number of controls and things that you need to put in place are much more narrowly focused, and so is not as complex a process as something as all-encompassing as 27001 or SOC 2. But having said that, I think it requires some deep, very specific knowledge about how to interpret the NIST standards and ensuring that you have all of your pieces lined up ahead of time before you enter into the audit process. Because I think that's, if you wait until the auditor comes in to explain to you what you're doing wrong, then you're going to have a hard time.
It's too late,
right? Yeah. And so being well prepared for that process makes it a reasonably straightforward audit, like other audits can be.
Yeah. And that's a quite good question, actually, is, what advice would you give to another company just thinking about going through the assurance program now, from your learnings, both this time and in previous ones?
So, I mean, I think I said my lot there. I mean, I do think that the, preparedness of the organization to enter into the audit process, the preparatory material that Kantara Initiative provides with respect to that, is incredibly useful, and so definitely start with that. And I think those things are generally available on the website. I don't think you have to go hunting and pecking for those too terribly far. But but being familiar with it and being able to understand what the expectation of that compliance requirement is important. So it's not just reading the words and checking boxes to say, those 5 buzzwords I have in my system, check, right? It's not quite that simple. And so you have to understand the underlying reasons for that compliance requirement to better really fully understand what IAL2 objectives really mean. That, they're not just words on paper, they actually have a semantic to them about true assurance that meets regulatory requirements, US government requirements in some cases. So to verify identities to most any agency in the US government is required to be IAL2 for a large percentage of their transactions. I mean, you saw that with the recent IRS program that kicked off at the beginning of the year, right? So that was an IAL2 requirement that they were fulfilling to provide a level of assurance of the taxpayer as you're filing your taxes. Yeah. And so those are just sort of early adopters, if you will, in the US government to apply to that. And of course, no sooner do they start complying to that the winds shift, and so now there's going to be a -4. And so
Coming soon.
So you get to restart all those engines again. But yeah, so I mean, I think that to the industry, it's going to become more meaningful. If for no other reason, it is a set of reference points that exist, and there are a handful of other countries that have comparable reference points. The UK does, for example. But even if there's 5 or 6 or 8 reference points, that's a lot more meaningful than just a businessy description of the process to try and placate a compliance department, because that's really the customer for these kinds of things. You must have a level of assurance of X in order for the customer to perform this transaction.
Sure. Okay. So just as we come to the end of the interview, then what's your prognosis for the industry, say in the next 3 to 5 years? What if you had a crystal ball, what do you think we'll see happening there?
So I do think we're going to see an increasing shift from centralized identity models to decentralized identity models. I'm not advocating for a particular kind of model necessarily, but I think that compliance departments in particular are eager to shed as much liability in the data that they hold on to about their customers and their partners that is going to compel pushing that data out to the edge and pushing it back into the user's hands and establishing a rapport with the user that when I need this data, you promise to give it to me again, as opposed to today, which is give it to me once and I'll just remember it.
Just keep using it.
Hope like heck that no one hacks into my database and takes it all. Because that's kind of where we are today. So I think that that's one. So this migration to user-controlled identity, but making and putting the user in the center of the identity transaction, I think are a couple of key. I'd like to say it's short term, but I think in reality, it's probably closer to the 5-year horizon. And in part because of what we were talking before, we don't yet have the right metaphor for people to engage in businesses in this way.
Yeah, the culture around it really for people to engage. Yeah. So with that in mind, and to reach that point, what would your advice to the industry be? So let's say to the CEOs collectively of organizations like Airside that are out there developing the technology to underpin this future state. What's your start, stop, and continue message to them? So what should the industry be looking to do, to start doing? What should it stop doing? And actually, what are we doing well and we should continue to do?
So I think to start, I think there's a groundswell of interest now in moving the verification and the establishment of a high assurance identity in a way that's reusable, and which in turn unlocks using high assurance identity to a bunch of other transactions, whether they're online or offline. And so the whole notion of having a provable verified identity on my device that I can then project out to relying parties as appropriate removes that piece of friction that exists between a checkout transaction or some finalization transaction with an online service and having a verified identity is a precursor to that. And so moving towards this reusability, by taking away that friction, you've completely opened up the market for places that you can use it. So I mean, I think that it's just to stop. So stop collecting all my data.
That's pretty clear. And what about continue?
Ask permission. It's okay to ask permission.
Yeah.
And I think this gets back to some of the human machine interface stuff that we were talking about. How do you do that so it's not, God, I'm tired of checking the consent button. And every time I go to a website and I have to dismiss the cookie warning is just a nuisance.
So frustrating. Yeah.
And so the risk is that we keep doing that kind of heavy-handed consent, sort of lawyer-driven UI, forgive me, lawyers, and move towards a much more meaningful exchange with the consumer that has all of the confidence of the consumer that you're doing the right thing with my data without putting a bunch of impediments between me and my objective and whatever online transaction I'm conducting. So I mean, I think that, to sum it up, I think that's the thing I'd like to see stop.
You don't change most. I think there's probably a few million people with you on that one. And then just, to end on a positive, what are we doing well, and what should as an industry, what we collectively should focus on continuing to do, and what should feel there?
So I think as technologists, we have done a pretty astounding job of understanding the problem and trying to build consensus around reasonable sets of solutions. We're not at a uniform consensus right now, and I think it's a little Pollyannish to think that that's going to that we're going to get down to one. But I do think that we've done the community as a whole a big service by trying to establish cross-industry collaborations with, between health and healthcare and open banking and travel sectors, and trying to avoid thinking about those as silos with different problems to solve, and thinking about them more as a holistic problem to solve. And to the extent that we can continue to do that, I think that the outcomes will be much more positive than if we end up with 10 siloed identity solutions. So I end up with, this metaphorical wallet with 10 flavors of identity in it, depending on whether I'm getting on an airplane or opening a bank account.
Going to work or being just at home. So Peter, thank you so much. It's been really interesting chatting with you. I know you're a busy man, and I appreciate there's a lot going on for Airside at the moment. So thank you very much to you and the team for making that time. We'll basically pull this all together, and as and when we can, we'll get it out there into the market, and hopefully be able to promote what Airside are doing, but also your views, which are great to hear on where the industry's going. So on behalf of the Kantara team, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Cool. So we stop recording there.